Welcome, everyone. Sorry it took us a few minutes because this is a Zoom panel and there are some of you here in the room, so we're organizing the hybrid format. And we're really excited to have you here today for this panel on women and planning, which has been organized by a student group called the Women's Planning Forum. And they're going to talk about some of their research. And then we have two guest speakers that will be part of a panel discussion. Melissa Perry from the Planning and Women Division of the American Planning Association, and Andy Miklo, who did a lot of this research for her dissertation, and she's now a practicing planner in Kings County, Washington. Next. First, we want to do the land acknowledgement. Cornell is located on the traditional homelands of the Guayacano, Cayuga Nation. The Guayacano are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell, New York State, and the United States. We acknowledge the painful history of Guayacano dispossession and honor the ongoing connection to Guayacano people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Next. So just to give you a little bit of background, back in 2013, the Women's Planning Forum joined with the Planning and Women Division of the APA to write a grant to the American Planning Association to do a study. The APA was not so much interested in gender, they were interested in aging. And so we said, okay, well, we'll do a study on gender and aging. And that way we were able to look at gender. And that theme will come back to us. Can gender ride the aging train? Because there seems to be a lot more interest in aging than there is in gender in planning. And this is one of our concerns. How do we get gender on the agenda of planners? And so we held a set of focus groups. We worked with the division throughout in a workshop class all that spring, and then we held a set of focus groups at the 2014 APA conference in Atlanta. We had about 40 planners from across the country participate. Next. And that resulted in 2 surveys. One was a survey on planning for women and aging relating to the grant we had gotten from APA. But what came out in the focus groups is that people were really concerned to also talk about gender dynamics in their planning workplaces. Half the conversation was about gender dynamics in the office as opposed to gender dynamics in your practice. And so we did a second survey in 2015 that Marissa Tereski turned into her master's thesis, and she's now getting her PhD at University of Southern California, looking at workplace dynamics in the planning workplace. Dr. Andy Miklo, who is one of our featured panelists today, organized and designed both of these surveys, shout out to Andy, and presented the results to an absolutely packed house at the 2015 APA National Conference. In fact, if the fire marshals had been there, they would have shut us down because people were hanging along the walls, sitting on the floors. And it was like gender had gone from an issue that it was really hard to get anybody to pay attention to something that people were hungry to hear more about. And Dr. Miklo used the Planning for Women and Aging survey as part of her dissertation. Next. Then in 2019, I was working with the International City County Management Association, doing a national survey of all cities and counties on the extent to which they're addressing age, all ages, children, young adults, middle age, older age, in their plans. And what we saw was a very slight improvement of addressing gender. Very slight, from 2% to 12%, from 2% of the 2014 survey to 12% in the 2019 survey. Still terrible, but a slight improvement. And we were curious as to whether or not it meant anything. So last spring in the workshop class, we had a team, and Chun and Wang are members of that team here today and have organized this panel for you. And we collaborated with Dr. Shui Zhang's Urban Data Analytics class to use natural language processing to see how gender issues are actually addressed in comprehensive plans. The students presented this work at the 2022 APA online conference, and the video and issue brief that they made are available on my local government restructuring lab website. And there are no short URLs with the Center for Cities Lab's website. That's the shortest one we've got. remember node/66, and you can help go there, or you can just look for Mildred Warner's Local Government Restructuring Lab. But anyway, with that, I want to turn it over. Oh, because we are in hybrid format, the approach today is going to be a panel discussion organized by you and Chun. And then we will have opportunities for you all to ask questions or make comments. Those of you online, which is about half the audience, please put them in the chat. Those of you here, please raise your hand and we'll try to get to you with microphones. Drew has one. He'll be on the other side of the room. I'll be on this side of the room. And our plan is to have this as a moderated discussion, a set of 4 questions we're going to go through. And then at the end, we'll open it up for full audience comment. So with that, let me turn it over to the president of the Women's Planning Forum, Wang.
Thank you, Mildred, and thanks for everyone for joining the panel. So the Women's Planning Forum celebrates women's contributions to the fields of planning and development, provides a forum for discussion of and education about gender issues, and embraces the full diversity of women. We strive to challenge women gender discrimination and promote gender equity in the classroom, university, and society. The WPF has been active advocating on behalf of faculty and student diversity, organizing discussions regarding women's issues, both internationally and domestically, and developing alumni networks for women in the field of planning. So please feel free to follow WPF on Instagram at Cornell-WPF and stay tuned for more exciting events. Next slide, please. And on behalf of the Women's Planning Forum, I am so glad and honored to introduce you to outstanding planners who during their work pay attention to women's issues. First, we have Ms. Melissa Dickens. She is the Strategic Planning and Policy Manager for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission, an independent consolidated planning agency serving approximately 1.5 million people in the Tampa Bay area. She currently serves as the Vice Chair for APA's Women and Planning Division, which provides a national network supporting and advocating for the needs of women in the planning profession. Ms. Dickens is also active in APA's Florida chapter, where she currently serves as VP of Communications and previously as chair of the Suncoast section. She is a frequent speaker at state and national conference on a variety of planning and professional development topics. Ms. Dickens has an undergraduate degree in urban studies and a graduate degree in city and regional planning, both from the University of Pennsylvania. Secondly, we have Dr. Andy Miklo. They is a principal legislative analyst with the Metropolitan King County Council in Seattle, Washington. Their work for the council focuses on regional planning, housing, and equity. Andy has a PhD in city and regional planning from Cornell University and a master's in urban and regional planning from Virginia Tech. Their dissertation, Peak Line Planning and the Need to Plan for Women, evaluates the level of gender responsive planning in a sample of United States communities. Next slide, please. We are so happy to have you both join the panel. So Melissa and Andy, what leads you to your interest in gender and planning?
I can go ahead and jump in first. First of all, thank you so much for that nice introduction. It's really wonderful to be here today. It's a nice distraction from the hurricane that is coming this way in Florida. So it's nice to be able to meet with you all and talk about this topic. So I am a little embarrassed to admit that this is somewhat of a recent interest of mine, but I think that speaks to the topic at hand today, which is that it's really not something that is generally part of planning conversations. It's not something that when I was in planning school was mentioned. It's really only started to happen within the past few years. But I became interested because of my role with the Women in Planning Division. This is a national network advocating for the needs of women in planning. It sounds very similar to the student organization that you all have. I'd encourage a quick plug for you all to join the Women in Planning Division. It's free for members for students. And we'd love to have more of this great energy and enthusiasm and interest part of the division. Thanks so much.
And also, thank you so much for having me as part of this panel and welcoming back to Cornell. It's really wonderful to see Milstein back there. I think so. For me, it's been a very logical and long path of gender and planning. My undergrad and master's are both from Virginia Tech. And while I was an undergrad there, I was heavily involved with organizations that feminist organizations and women's organizations on campus. And when I got my master's degree there, one of the professors was like, hey, you should read this work by Marcia Ritzdorf. And Marcia Ritzdorf was probably my inspiration for this work for gender, and wrote a lot in the 90s about women's experience in zoning. And she was a professor at Virginia Tech before I was there. And so after reading Dr. Ritzdorf's work, I was instantly enamored, and it just really hit on everything that I had been my undergrad interest and then my interest in planning. And so then I wrote my master's thesis on the gender implications of Euclidean zoning. And then that turned into my dissertation topic on pink blind planning. So it's been a long path, but definitely something now that I think about was heavily inspired by my time at Virginia Tech. So great to be back. Happy to have this conversation.
Very beautiful. And I believe this must resonate a lot with feminist planners and planning students here. And under the supervision of Professor Warner and Dr. Xuezhang, Chun Xu, an MRP graduate student, led a gender team last semester, researched the comprehensive planning in the United States through a gender lens. They would like to find out if the communities saying yes to the question, have you addressed women's issues, really pay attention to women's needs. Chun, could you please tell us more about the project?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. So my name is Chun. I am a recent Cornell MRP graduate. Today I'm going to share our research we did last semester, Invisible Women in Comprehensive Plans. You can find all the information through the link on the top right corner. So first, why do we want to do this research? The motivation comes from the male bias in traditional planning paradigms. Planning is asserted to be neutral, but actually targets a small group of population who are 25 to 55 years old, androgynous, but implicitly for men. This group of people usually have the average height and reach and the highest sensory abilities. But diversity always exists. Everyone else not in this targeting group has to adapt to the default. On the other hand, according to the two surveys Professor Warner mentioned before, we found that women's needs are often neglected. The 2014 APA survey showed that only 2% of comprehensive plans address the needs of women. The survey also found that gender rises the aging trend, which means through addressing the needs of senior group, we may also help women. This number increased to 12% in the 2019 ICMA survey. But still, compared to the other groups, women account for a small portion, much less than family, child, and senior. So how did we carry out our research? Briefly, we want to know how women exist in comprehensive plans. We utilize the machine learning methods to study quantities of plan documents and search the keywords related to women. According to the 2019 survey, we collected 80 comprehensive plans from which communities respond yes for addressing women's needs. To identify the keywords, we interviewed several members from APA Women and Planet Division, including Melissa and Andy, and inspired by them, we finalized our keywords and categorized them as identities and planning elements. Identities include women, family, child, senior, poverty, etc. These identities work as control group for comparison. On the other hand, if we couldn't find the direct relevance between women and planning elements, which we expect, they are the bridge of the indirect connection. Planning elements include housing, land use, transportation, public space, surveys, social engagement, and economic development. Then we use natural language processing to let machines study the plans, locate and count the keywords in the plans. Based on the relevant context, we then analyze the results. First, we want to know that in all 80 plans we collected, how many plans mention the identity word at least once? Interestingly, but not surprisingly, we found that women are mentioned only in 40% of all plans, while the other identities appear in twice as many plans. Almost all the plans mentioned family, child, senior, poverty, race, but not women. When looking at the frequency of identity words, women only account for 4% of all 8,000 records of identity words we found, while the number of family is 35%, which is extremely high. Well, through context reading afterward, we found that over half of family words appear as single-family housing and multi-family housing, which do not represent family as an identity. Without these specific phrases, the percentage of family is about 11%, similar to the percentage of poverty. Then we try to locate the planning element words in the subcontext containing these identity words. We are doing this to figure out how planning elements are related to identities. In total, we found 86,000 matches between identities and planning elements, as shown in the diagram. The left white of the flow represents the identity proportion, while the right represents the planning element proportion. We use red for women. As we can see, most red lines flow to the service, public space, and social engagement, which means women are mentioned more together with those planning elements. Well, we rarely see red flows in land use, housing, transportation, and economic development. Further looking into the detailed numbers, there are two dimensions we are using here. In the left graph, we can see the frequency of planning elements. Surveys, public space, and social engagement are the top three mentioned planning elements related to identities. The second dimension, as we can looking at the right graph, it is the distribution of the percentage of identities mentioned together with planning elements. Women, the orange bar, is the least mentioned identity, accounting for less than 6%, even in those top three planning elements. Well, family, the yellow one, and children, the blue one, add up to more than half. Since we know that there are women's needs in trip training and affordable housing, we expect women are mentioned more in housing, transportation, land use, and economic development. However, women are actually not there. We also found that family, the yellow, takes the largest proportion of 4 elements. This can be related to single-family housing, as we mentioned earlier. Property, the gray color, is mentioned a lot in economic development. And senior, the green, is the main concern in transportation. In all, the visibility of women is far behind expectation. Here are our takeaways. First, neutral is actually not neutral. Women are left behind from the comprehensive planning trend. Among all identities, women are mentioned at the least, less than family, child, senior, and even less than property and race. Even mentioned, women mostly appear in the demographic section. Second, does gender ride the family child aging trend? For all the length of women's roles, women as care providers are considered most, if addressed. Women's needs might be addressed by family, child, or aging, but not enough at all. Family implants is usually single-family housing, which does not address the needs of care work. Therefore, we want to ask, when and how can women get their own car? The situation is, physical design issues such as safety, trip training are rarely mentioned. Economic development typically ignores care work. Women as individuals with unique needs are still invisible. And inattention to women's needs leads to their marginalization. So we suggest that gender-sensitive planning can benefit women by giving their time back. Women also need to be more involved in the planning process. Finally, it is advisable that comprehensive plans should be updated with new concepts like trip planning, accessibility, care work, complete street, universal design, and any other ideas towards equity. That is all about our research. You can find more information on the website. And next, we will enter the discussion section to discuss this topics based on this research. So the first question is, should planning explicitly call out women's issues and needs? Or should planning just use the language being neutral and universal? Melissa, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think you just very eloquently showed a lot of the issues with thinking that something is universal. This is something that we see in all kinds of data where men's perspective is considered to be the universal perspective, while women's perspective is considered niche. And, you know, thinking through the idea of neutrality, we think about how neutrality usually means that it's written and decided and designed by those in power. And siding with neutrality is siding with those who have more power and more ability to get their perspective out. I'll also say that our code of ethics, for those who are AICP certified or hoping to get AICP certified, directs planners explicitly that we should advocate on behalf of the underserved. And it's very clear from your presentation that women are definitely underserved in planning. So it would be a best practice to call it out specifically. And I do have one more thought. I think, you know, it's important also to think about kind of the unintended consequences or the good intentions that sometimes have a different outcome that we might expect. One of the things that I think would be really important to consider and think about when calling out gender and women's needs explicitly in comprehensive plans is to make sure that we're not, you know, with the best of intentions, inadvertently perpetuating some of the inequities that women experience. So lending credence, more credence than already exists, to the idea that women should be primarily responsible for care work. You know, I would love for a time to come when we see a 50-50 division of this type of work. But I think that can be resolved by just being really thoughtful about the policies and thinking through different consequences and different ways that they may play out.
Andy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. So I think I've got a lot of thoughts on all of these questions. Again, thank you so much for putting together this panel. I think the important part here, again, that was a really great presentation. It really said essentially that how can something be neutral? And I think that's what I would like to say is that I think what's important for me to highlight is this decision to exclude women, and women, and I mean that in the most universal term, and we can talk about how that identity excludes. These were all intentional decisions. This is not an unintentional thing. The planning paradigm is, as you said, perpetuated by the people in power, and the people in power and have been white men. And the fact that our planning paradigm is meant to serve them and continues to do, and people that tend to want to value something that's different are up against, and I think this is an excellent metaphor, that graphic of a train. You're literally up against a train and trying to stop a train. And I think that's something to really think about. Like, you have this entire planning paradigm that's based on this, what we would say, a universal or rational economic man. And we've tried to disrupt it so many times, and yet we're still here asking these types of questions. So I think it's, for me, what I want to say about whether or not we should explicitly call out it in plans is that I think planners should be calling this stuff out. I'm not entirely sure what a plan looks like. I think, based on my previous statement, that maybe we really need to rethink how we do all of our land use in terms of comprehensive planning and zoning. I think if it's problematic from its foundations, how are we going to continue to put band-aids on it? And it's not just problematic for women, it's problematic, as you identified, for people of different abilities, different races, different everything. And I think what's important, and we can talk about it, is for planners to start to call out these things and to put these ideas into plans and say, what about when we'll talk about that. But I think it's really important, maybe from my perspective, for the planners to be explicitly calling this out rather than the plans themselves.
That is an excellent point. As myself, I think it's important, but some people just feel like it's not comfortable to call out everything. But the next question I'm going to ask is, in what ways could we mainstream the gender perspective in planning if we want to call out? For example, gendered division of physical space, or safety, or trip training, or community-supported care work. In what ways should we mainstream? Melissa, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I actually think it's important to take it even back a level, because these are all wonderful ideas and things that should be incorporated. And I think, that really we also need to think about the fundamentals about how we're collecting information that goes in the plan, who's participating in the process. And also, this forum is just such a great first step. It needs to be something that planners are educated on early on. There needs to be this basis of knowledge. And talking about these discrepancies and these differences is really huge. So kind of thinking about those sort of foundational things, public participation is a really good first step. Using engagement tools that garner women's input, looking at who's participating, the representation, the time of day that these meetings are held, providing a virtual option, providing childcare, and really being explicit, saying, bring your families, we will have activities for the children. That ensures that that everyone, whoever is the caregiver, is able to attend, and really enhances the representation in the planning process. And I think too, thinking about data, I see a lot of planning surveys, in full disclosure, that our agency does, where we ask questions about age, we ask questions about race and ethnicity, but gender is really missing from those surveys. And I think it's good that we start including that and start looking at the differences in the responses and the differences in the data, and continuing to build that knowledge base and build the data around different ways that men and women experience place, experience transportation. I think getting those foundational things right is going to be really important. And I'm really just excited that this is part of the conversation, that this is something that is happening. There have been, some I can think of, sadly, on one hand, some examples of innovative policies that I've seen. And it's really something where we need to, of course, change the plans, change the policies, but just get the inputs right. I think will be a huge first step.
Thank you, Melissa. That's an excellent segue into actually what I was going to say, is that I think if we actually look at, so gender mainstreaming is something that's done. I'm not sure if people have read the background papers or research on this, is something that is a concept that's done in Europe and in that area. And that's exactly what they do. It starts at the back level, that these questions in this, and I think what I'm trying to say is I think we really need to acknowledge the political climate that the American planning paradigm is in the way it views women. Women in this country, we're at a very interesting political, I say that as, you know, women as broadly, you get where I'm going with that term. It's a very, with the Supreme Court and a lot of these things that we've seen over the past, like, it's not a comfortable space. And I think that's something that we really need to acknowledge. So I think that when we talk about gender mainstreaming in Europe and these countries where it's been successful, it's because it's like, yeah, that's real. Women are acknowledged, and men or any other person that like has care needs, right? And it's like breaking down information by gender isn't something that's novel. Like, it's 2022 and it's novel to break down and try putting a new thing in there like that. And so I think like a lot of these questions were up here, and it's like, why should we plan for women? And it's like, why are we not planning for women? And like, unfortunately, the real question is like, and I hate, you know, as like a planner, you have to justify this stuff. And it's really hard to justify it if what you're seeing in this country is people not saying what you think matters. So we have this like kind of tension here that like we're hitting on in planning, is like, hey, women are important, but the political context of the country, I would assert, is saying women are not important. And so I think there's a real tension here of even having like this conversation, and why we're not taught this in planning schools, but like why it's successful in other places is, in my opinion, very much, you know, we really need to acknowledge the context in the countries and this, all of what we're planning in.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in real quick because I think that's a great point. So I'm coming to you all from Florida. You may know a bit about our political context right now. But I think to add to that point, I think that if, you know, so certain areas, for example, in Tampa, we could be very, you know, very strong and robust in our language about these topics. In other areas, and I want to frame this sensitively, and I hope it is perceived as such. You know, there may be, unfortunately, just because of the paradigm that we're all working with, there may be a minimization of something as women's issues being a niche issue, or even, unfortunately, a bit of backlash, which is really awful. I wish it was not that way, but I think if that is the context in which you recognize your elected officials are operating, probably maybe you could find another job that might be more friendly to these things. But secondly, I think, you know, thinking about some of the data that we have about trip chaining, about the pink tax on transportation, about some of these things, and putting them in plans without explicitly mentioning it may also be another option if you're working in some communities that, unfortunately, for whatever reason, are not as receptive to this. So I just want to, you know, jump in and add that as well.
I think there is a question. Do you want to ask out?
Yes, we have a very interesting question from the Carrie Mellon. So he asks, so in your opinion, Andy, is there a conflict between achieving gender equity in society, yet planning for roles and associated land use and transportation patterns that are uniquely those of women? If so, how do you reconcile this conflict?
Let me read your question and make sure I understand it. And let's see.
Okay. So he asks, is there a conflict between achieving gender equity in society? Yet, planning for roles and associated land use and transportation patterns that are uniquely of those of women. If so, how do you reconcile the conflict?
Yeah, I think maybe Melissa actually kind of spoke to this when she was talking about, like, if we're planning for women, we need to be careful. And when we're saying for planning for women, we don't reinforce those roles and those assumptions about planning for women. So I think, yes, there is a conflict of that you don't put yourself into this circle of reinforcing those roles. I think that's a really great point to bring up. I very much focus on how the land use and our systems of planning and the actual landscape reinforce these roles and embed them even more. But I think this question of planning for women and these assumptions of what that looks like, yeah, I do think that there's a conflict there. And how do I reconcile that? If I could figure out how to reconcile all of these things, I think I'd do it. I think it'd be the best thing in the world. But I think, when I think of this question, I think of this for every other identity set or intersecting identities. I think about it for race. I think about it for all of these different things. So I think the answer is yes. And it's a great question. I'd love to hear if there's any thoughts from the audience.
Chun, we also have a question from Han Taosun regarding the interpretation of your project results. He asks, does a low intensity of mentioning women in planning documents really mean that they are missing? Or does this indicate that the dichotomy of women or men create less inequity, that say races, and that indicate gender issues may not be so urgent compared with racial issues for planners? Or for example, if you search man or white, he feels that it could probably the frequency will be even lower than women.
Thanks for this question. Actually, it is a good question. My opinion is, when we start this research, we are suggesting, indicating that women might not be there because planning has the tradition to make the language to be neutral. But what we did is that we want to compare women, not compare women with men, but compare, for example, compare women with race or women with other group like family or senior. It's not like it's in the different side of women, it is men, because we think according to our literature review, according to the planning tradition, men is always there. When we start to plan for a city, men is the mainstream. I mean, they are the working group, and they are the one who make profits for the city, and they are someone who go out for working, and then they are using mainly using the urban space. But the society changes. Women go outside their door to go to work, and they are also the main part of the society. But the city, from the beginning, they are designed for men. I will say that men is not in the plan, in the words, but they are implicitly there. So that is why we search women as a word, and we think that call out women is a necessity, because the default option is men. And also in the research, we compared women with other groups like race and like family. If they are in the same level, we will say that, well, plan is neutral because they call out these things in the same level, but actually women is called out the least. That is my response. I'm not sure if Melissa or Andy have any other things to add to that point.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, may I jump in? I don't know who I interrupted.
Oh, sorry, please go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think this question of urgency, I think, is a really interesting word. And I am not sure that that's exactly what we're all I'm not saying urgency. I don't think we can say that somebody's identity is more important. I think that's for a person to say. And I think we'll talk about that when we get to like participation, and where I think that's where the real change can happen. But I think that's a really interesting word to say, urgency. I think yeah, there's something that pinged on me for the word urgency, and I'm not entirely sure that like any planner would say it's really about just making a good community. And I think that these are all various lenses to look at what makes a good community. And I think that that's kind of what Mildred's work was saying, is like, if we plan for like an older person and various abilities, right? Like we just need to make a good community. But I think this question of urgency was just a very interesting point there.
Yes, thank you so much for your answers. And Nick wants to think more about the binary. So he asks the students about their analysis, and also this is a good question for the panelists. So he is curious if and how the analysis of the planning documents go beyond the binary lens. Are plans or planning documents taking into consideration the people who do not identify as male or female? This is a good question.
I think I can go first because I did the analysis, and the interesting finding is we do search the words like LGBTQ and homosexual, a lot of things that is not only male and female. But when we search these words, there is no result find that. So we also consider if there is words like all gender, but there is not much. But I would like to hear about some opinions from the Andy side or Melissa side.
Sure, I'll just briefly go first. I'm not sure if, is everyone okay in the room? It sounded like there was a big beep. Okay. I think this comes back to data as well. So making sure when you're asking questions, survey questions, not just sticking to binary. I mean, to me, that is to the strictly male, female options. I think that, you know, that is one easy way to try to be as inclusive as possible in terms of gender identity. That is one way to try to make sure that everyone feels included and everyone's voice is accounted for. But I am very interested to hear what others say as well. Thank you.
So for me, this question actually really resonates very personally. I identify outside of the binary. I'm a non-binary. My preferred pronouns are they, them. And so I think this is something that I wrestled with a lot writing this dissertation, in terms of this is exactly the question that I wrestled with, is one, by doing my own work on women, that implies essentially a binary of man. And so in my own work and my own analysis, I was excluding myself. And that was something that I had to make that choice. But like, I do think that is problematic in a lot of things. And right, it is male, female, choose not to answer, you know, right? Like it's always othering. It's always othering. And I think that's a real thing. So on a personal level, that was really, really hard for me. But I think what else is to be acknowledged is that when we do use the term woman, it also implies, just as much as man implies white man, I think when we say woman, it implies white woman. And I think that's something that I also had to try to work with in my dissertation. And I'm fortunate that mine's kind of like a mixed methods approach. So I tried to like talk through some of those issues, but I do think that this question of a gender binary, and by saying women, who are we excluding, is a real question. Or if we say men, women, other, or, you know, it's all these other categories. And I don't have an answer exactly of how to deal with this. I think this gets back to community engagement and realizing and acknowledging. I think that people's experiences are very valuable. I was recently, I think I'll tell a little story, in a meeting where in King County in Seattle, we have don't know if you know this, big housing crisis, crazy. And so one of the things we're working on is an affordable housing plan and how to get affordable housing and county-wide need. And we had somebody from the State Department of Commerce coming to give a presentation to the local planners in the jurisdictions. And one of the local planners was talking about community engagement and was like, well, do you have the data to support the community engagement? And it was really funny to me because I had to watch this person who's a community engagement specialist think to how to answer this question, that like the data is the community engagement. And I think that like that was, I think there's a real need in planning that we think like data means census data. And so I think acknowledging multiple identities and intersecting identities means you have to talk to people and engage. And I'm not exactly sure what I mean more than that. But I think this question of the binary is super important when we talk about identities, and especially women.
Yes, and also starting from the question of diversity, of acknowledging multiple needs, Madeline B also reminds us of the complexity when thinking about women, because she reminds us that it's problematic for us to speak about women in a universal way, because this will suggest that all women experience our cities equally, but that's not the case, right? So this is really very clear that in the US context. And while advising a planning that put women and their needs at the center, how are you considering intersectionality in your work? White women experience in our cities is totally different from the Black women, neither for other intersections.
Yeah, I think Andy answered this or started to touch on this really well and really thoughtfully. And I just want to add a couple of things. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that data itself, although we think it's neutral, a lot of the data that we rely upon is in surveys that are designed by a particular group. The engagement is done in a way that disproportionately is collecting data and designed for white men, white women, even university studies. If you think about who's in universities, it's a very particular set of people that are students. So I think it's important to acknowledge that data itself has bias and think about ways that we can remove the bias from data. There's a fantastic book called Invisible Women that talks about the lack of representation for women in data. And that's certainly, unfortunately, when you look at intersecting identities is unfortunately even, there's even less data on women of color. And so, really thinking about the way that engagement methods are designed is critical. Thinking about the data that's collected is critical. And as Andy said, not just relying on the data to tell the story. I mean, you get a very, I don't know, we say this all the time in my office, data does not make decisions, emotions make decisions, and real world experience makes decisions in the elected official sphere particularly. So, needing to, get the elected officials out in the community, taking the bus, experiencing what it's like to walk down the street in different areas of the community, having planners not just plan from their desks, not just looking out the window, but really getting out and seeing, walking different blocks, walking different times of day, seeing who's out and who's using the space and in what way, I think can be just as informative and helpful as looking strictly at data.
Okay, let's go to our third question. Sorry for the listeners, there's some situation happening, but I'm okay, I'm fine. Our second question is, as we said a lot, there are something happening, but I wonder, do actions come first? Since gender and women are barely mentioned in the plans, does the actions come first? For example, maybe there are some projects already in practice or in efforts to promote gender beneficial policies. Do you want to go first, Melissa?
Sure. So Andy mentioned a lot of great examples out of Europe. That's what I've seen is gender mainstreaming has been happening there for longer. There's also a really good study out of LA. LA Metro did a study of the travel differences between men and women in using public transit and women's additional safety concerns that they have, and additionally, because of trip chaining, their additional cost in taking transit. So that is something that is really important to, again, just getting women's perspectives in the planning process. I've also seen, and unfortunately, I can't remember the community, but it was looking at parks. So a lot of the parks and uses for teenagers, right? It's things like skateboarding, it's things like basketball. And that is certainly not to say that teen girls do not skateboard or play basketball, because many of them do. But they're really geared around athletics. And, you know, there's a real opportunity to engage young people, engage teenagers of both, of all gender identities, and look at how they're using the space, what their desired use of the space is. And so even thinking, you know, to the next generation, a way to engage youth in this process and start thinking about how we can look at projects and look at things differently is going to be really critical. And I had one more thought, but I lost it. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andy for their thoughts. I'm really interested.
Thank you. I have a lot of thoughts, and I again really appreciate this this space to talk about these things. I will say that my work is very interesting. I will say briefly, I'm a policy analyst, and I work for the King County Council. So what that means is I don't really do the day-to-day planning or community engagement or write the policies, but I work for the elected officials. So I work directly for those elected officials. And I provide the planning support for them. So when the plans come over to council, my questions are generally like, who did you talk to? And so I try to inform our council members on like what should be being done in a planning process. And so I have a really interesting kind of role right now because I am a planner, but I'm also working kind of very much in this like elected space. And so I'm very much aware of a lot of these tensions, and where I'm very happy is my role requires me to be very neutral and nonpartisan. So it's very nice to have a space where I can kind of talk about these. And so I think what I'm going to say is I've had some thoughts, I've been writing them down. I think, yes, I think actions, I think we're starting to see if we want to affect change, do need to come first. I think that, I don't know what that looks like, but you know, it used to be like, I can't even remember the word, something about like urbanism, and you make the space yours. And so I think, you know, I think actions do need to come first, and I'm not entirely sure they need to be the planners' actions. I know we're here in a room of planners, but when I think now, if I would have a space of thinking about the future generation of planners, I guess that's my audience. I would say thinking about creating spaces and opportunities to allow people to do what they want. Like a skate park's a great idea, but like, how could you do a flexible space that would allow multiple types of users, that their cultural identity, their race, their gender, all of these things allow them to feel safe is I think the question. And I would also, so I think that implementation of plans we should talk about, but I also think actions from the community are super important in acknowledging those as and input to our planning. And then I would also say that I think, again, knowing my audience, that maybe we need to think about what it looks like to informalize our planning processes as well. So right, we're very well trained in terms of, you know, I learned how to like measure slopes and draw wetlands by hand in my master's program. But I've also learned how to do community engagement. And so maybe sometimes our roles should be, we should think of them as completely different. Maybe we shouldn't be the technical experts, but maybe like we are, but like, I don't know. So maybe instead of us going to the community, we somehow use the community in a better way that's not disempowering, where we respect their time, we pay them. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but for some reason, I keep going back to this informalization of planning, and I don't know what that means yet.
Yeah, I think, tactical urbanism as well, and really letting the community lead the discussion is critical, because I mean, even we have a program at my agency that does planning for children. It's called Future Leaders in Planning, and we go to different neighborhoods around Tampa Bay and have groups of kids come up with planning solutions. Usually they're just as good as our ideas. You know, they know where there's gaps in the sidewalk. They know where they have to walk longer to get to a park or to get to school, or which intersections and crosswalks are dangerous. Even my 7-year-old, we went driving out further out, kind of the exurbs, and she asked, why are there no sidewalks here? Why is it just roads? And so, I think people know these things, community members know these things, and it's our job to make it easy for them to tell us.
Thanks so much, Melissa and Andy, for your answers. They're so beautiful. And our last question is women's participation in planning really enough to get women's issues on the table? How do we get the paradigm changed? We have this question because in our research, we found that women are actually very willing to get participated in the public meetings. We do find in some communities, women will participate more than men. However, this doesn't necessarily get their questions, their problems, their needs on the table. How do you think about this?
I can go first. So my emphatic answer is no, it's not enough. I think that it shouldn't just be on women. Women have a lot of things already that we are responsible for, that we are working towards, that we're working to change, but we need everyone, regardless of how they identify, to think about gender and think about how it impacts cities. I'll just say that from a practitioner perspective, even though women make up 50% or more of planners, we are not as well represented in planning leadership. We're not at the table a lot of times in those discussions. For example, the FAICP, which is considered the most prestigious group of planners, women make up only 22% of that group, and we're still not nominating women with the same gender parity. So, even within our own profession, we need to do some looking at this issue, and we need the support of our male allies. We also need more women in decision maker roles in our elected bodies. Tampa City Council, which Tampa is, particularly for Florida, quite a progressive place. We had, until earlier this year, 7 city council members, all of them men. And so it's unfortunate that representation is not happening to the same degree in our elected officials. And, when we think about women taking office, we also need to think about women of color. We need to think about making sure that those intersecting identities are represented in positions of leadership. And, you know, we really have to look at the whole structure, and just having women as planners is a good, very baby first step, but we really need everyone to be aware of these issues and everyone working for change.
So I will also say emphatically, no, it's not enough. But I think, you know, I'm struck by the question is we return to, and I think we've all just said is, who is planning actually working for? And I think if we like go back and we review like who that one group is, like, is it ever going to be enough? If we ever like, how do we get to paradigm change? I think is the real question. Like, I think that's the question. We know it's not working. We know it's not working for pretty much everybody. And we've known this for decades. We've known this. And we still continue to do the same thing. And I think that's a great question. I have another anecdote, which I think is interesting. So I was working on some countywide planning principles, and I was staffing this for one of our council members. And I remember in the meeting, we were going through like promote strategies for, you know, some sort of businesses. And my council member was like, why is women-owned businesses not there? It was like a list of 20 different like identity types. And I was like, that's a great question, council member. And so we put it in there, and it was really like not funny, but like really funny for me at the time, because I was aware of your research project, because you had reached out to me, and I was like, funny story, this will be probably one of the only plans in the entire country that uses the word woman. And it was really interesting because she was just like, what? And so I think like even just finding, I think participation is important, but I think participation in electeds and decision-making, and I just want to echo the planning dynamic of who's in decision-making authorities within planning. I've never had a female supervisor in planning. That's crazy. I've been in the field for 15 years. So I think that's really, really telling, except for Mildred, who's great, but I wouldn't say supervisor. So I think, yeah, I think paradigm change is absolutely necessary. I'm not entirely sure what that word looks like though.
Mildred, do you want to add more points on this question?
Yeah, paradigm change comes hard and it's super painful. So about 20 years ago, I tried to get childcare into planning, and AICP invited me to do a case study, and then they took away the invitation because childcare didn't have anything to do with planning. And then the first time in 2007, when we had a focus group session on having plans be more friendly to families and children, they put us at the offsite conference hotel on the last afternoon of the last day of the conference because we were a marginal issue that didn't matter. But planning has a capacity to change. And so a few years later, I got an award for doing this work addressing childcare. So just because you get told, just got turned off. Maybe it doesn't need it. It was too loud. Just because you get told no once. Just because you get told no once, try again. And that's what I guess I've been impressed with planning, even though planning is male dominated, planning is narrow, planning is also responsive, and it's responsive in a way some other fields are not. So when we were doing our childcare work and we were trying to put childcare on the agenda of economic development planners, we were told, no, childcare doesn't count. It's just commodified household labor. Therefore, it does not deserve any of the tools in the toolbox of economic development planners. You don't count. And then later, we started figuring out ways to use those tools and count it. And then local economic development planners would say, you're giving me cover. And we would publish reports and put them out through APA so that would give local planning practitioners cover. And they'd say, well, even though you think this is radical and crazy, the APA has an issue brief on childcare as economic development. This is best practice. And so don't be afraid to be a change agent in this profession. It is possible. And I'm telling you, after 30 years of working in it, I have seen positive change. But have a support group, because when you're told that you don't count, it hurts. And it can hurt you professionally. Your articles get rejected. Your classes don't count at the university where you teach. I mean, being told you don't count is really hurtful. And I've had it happen to me a lot, but keep trying, build your coalition, and, you know, be the change you want to see in the world. It is possible. So I turn it back to our panelists. And we've been getting lots of questions on the chat. This is a case where the people in Zoom are privileged, and the others who are sitting here in this room who don't turn on their computers have a harder time asking a question. Are there any questions in the audience in this room? Yes, up at the top of the woman in the white shirt. And let's see if yours works, Drew.
Hello, is it okay working? Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask, this is circling back earlier, I believe Ms. Dickens talked about how there are some good positive examples of more gender inclusive and innovative policies. And so this is for everyone on the panel. But if you guys could please just elaborate on some of those examples and why you think it worked, if it was more political context or just effective language, or something else. Thank you.
I think it really took, as Mildred was saying, it really took change agents who are planners pushing these issues forward. The LA Metro study was pushed forward by planners, certainly had the political context to make it work. But, just starting to raise the issue and raise the discussions is a good first step toward making those changes. I'll find the link and unfortunately put it in the chat, but hopefully it can be sent out. There's a really good planner advisory service report on gender mainstreaming and practices that happen around the country, the few that there are, and then also additional information about the studies, or excuse me, the projects in Europe. And also about how to integrate gender mainstreaming within planning documents and how to make sure that not only are women represented on the front end, but also that the impact of projects don't disproportionately benefit one gender over another.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much for the panel. Andy, hi, this is Nima. So I'm struck. So I've looked at questions of gender for my entire career and before that. And so I'm struck by this sense of like, this is a new issue being discovered, because it's not. And I think it's really important to stress maybe what Andy said, and I just want to sort of add my voice to her point, which is that these questions have been on the table across the world for many decades. The real issue becomes, when do they disappear and come back? So when I came to Cornell in 2001, it was not cool to talk about women or gender. And, it was, a lot of my students would be very vehement about not being feminist. And now it's cool again. And so it's a interesting, I think it's really interesting for all of us here in the room to think about when it moves in and out of fashion, both socially, culturally, and in policy terms, right? The other piece that I had a question on or a comment on is this. I hear you in the panel talking a lot about Europe, but not about sort of what's happening in international development, where gender has been on the agenda for a very long time. So 1979, was when CEDAW was signed, right? And the United States refused to be a signatory, signed at some point, but never ratified the convention. So there were like 3 or 4 countries, I've forgotten which ones exactly, but the US is one of them, which has never ratified a convention that was ratified by the rest of the world. And so that to me is a really interesting question, right? So the gender and development world is active. Anne Phillips wrote her book on the politics of presence in 1997. And so part of the question then might be, I agree with Mildred, planning is a capacious profession and a field. And it turns and it accepts and it expands. But the real question for me when it comes to questions of gender is the constant cycle of disappearance and reappearance. This is not new. So let's not kid ourselves that it's new. It's been on the agenda since the 70s. Why does it keep disappearing?
Thank you. Those were excellent comments / questions. Yes, I'm going to respond by just quickly saying, I think that there is an interesting point, and I have a very quick line in my dissertation where it was just kind of a question of exactly that, why some of these discussions have continued in a lot of other international and gender and development language in this discussion, and they stopped in the US. I think that is a fascinating question. I want to highlight that because and acknowledge exactly what you just said, is that there's a lot of other literature, and it's in acknowledging it's just not my area of knowledge and expertise, but there's conversations that have been ongoing for decades, like you said, since the 70s. And have been much stronger, and there have been a lot more policies that have come out globally, and a lot more money, and all of these different things that we see. So thank you very much for your comments.
We also have some input from Erin Bass in the chat box. I read them. Or Dr. Erin Bass, do you want to share your points with the audience? I'm not sure whether she is here or not. She says, just as the public meetings require sign language interpreters and handouts in a variety of languages, perhaps childcare and provisions must also be provided as a requirement for all public meetings. And also she said, given that women are primarily responsible for children, women's movements are constricted because they are incorporating others in their daily movement. This is often not true for men, and the concerns of children are expected to be addressed by women. The shared responsibility of family life is beginning to change. However, at this time, women are assuming these needs under the assumption that women will solve those daily needs of life must be incorporated into policy decisions. Again, the recognition of family life as a women's responsibility needs to be examined when making policy decisions.
Thank you for reading that. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. My camera doesn't work. I have been a member of APA since probably 1980, and all of the women who are from that generation, I applaud you for sticking by. And yes, things do change. I have had very similar experiences that they described earlier. And I just want to thank you very much for doing this panel. And I don't know what else I could add. I think everything has been said. It is a cyclical thing, and I do believe things will change, but it's not going to change unless we do the work. And it's nice to see this group. And it's just, I'm just so grateful that you're all here today. Okay, thanks.
one more thought. And I'm sorry, was there a question? I can't see the room. I apologize.
Please go ahead, Mary.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I was gonna mention that just how we have to be careful of unintended consequences of these policies. There may be some unintended positive benefits as well that benefit other folks who may not identify as women. So I know that although I had a very abstract and academic appreciation for ADA and all of the changes that were required in public space and buildings as a result of that legislation, I did not really recognize the how much I would appreciate it when I became a mother and was pushing strollers. Just the idea of curb cuts and trying to get a stroller up over those, that wasn't a result of legislation that was specifically aimed at women. I mean, even, you know, taking a small child to the bathroom with you, it's often easier in larger bathroom stalls. And, you know, again, that legislation was critical and much needed for people with disabilities, but it also had the unintended impact of making women's lives better. And I think as they move around public space, and I think that the same could also be true for a lot of the policies that would be developed to benefit women. It probably would benefit a much larger umbrella than that. And so I think it's important to think about that as well.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel and to our students for having organized this. I have two questions, if that's not being too greedy. For Melissa and for Andy, it happens that I teach our Intro to Planning and History and Practice class, and this week was Gender Week. And on Thursday, we had one of our TAs teach the class, and he did a wonderful job. But he ended his talk about feminist and gendered approaches to planning, highlighting that maybe we should move away from gender and embrace instead a kind of care urbanism, because that would be a more inclusive approach to also allowing other genders to engage in care and to think about them. You've iterated here, you know, this tension between aging and gender, and you've hinted at how it's not enough to only think about women as it relates to their duties of care, but also about women separate from those duties of care. And I think I would appreciate, for the sake of my students, many of whom are here, for you to explicitly call out why that is the case. So that's my first question. My second question is for, okay, sorry.
I can go first, and then I definitely want to hear Andy's thoughts on this. So one area that is outside of the realm of care is women's perceived safety and women's actual safety. When it comes to navigating public space, I cannot tell you how many times I have been in a dark parking garage and thought, why is this not more well lit? Why is there no lighting? I don't feel safe. That means that if women don't feel safe, they're not going to use the space. They're not going to have access to the space, and they're not going to have access to the same kinds of amenities and opportunities that men get to enjoy. So safety and security is either perceived or actual. If it impacts the use of the space, is something that, is really critical to think about.
See here, I've got two thoughts on that. I've been asked this question, I think, not this question, but this question of who's the subject of our planning work has come up in a couple of these discussions I've been in recently. If they should it be these identities, which is either your race, your gender, your intersections, or whether or not it should be a care approach, or what I would say could be like a needs approach. I think I'm starting to see that out in Seattle, where we're trying to plan for needs. And like I said, we see that a lot right now. The focus is on like affordable housing, but affordable housing as a need, like housing as a need, and all of the kind of like planning that goes into that. So that means it needs to be near transportation and services. And then that means we need to do better transportation and services. So I'm seeing in Seattle, in terms of like the language of policies, we're starting to see a shift in almost a removal of identity and a shift towards a needs approach. I have no thought exactly on if I think that's better or worse. I think it's just something that's happening. And the second part, I kind of want to maybe respond back to something that Mildred said, and about, I do think absolutely planning has changed, has the capacity to change. It's a field that's oriented around change, right? Like that's like the whole point, is to change. And so I think what's interesting about that, though, is that gender responsive or race responsive or anything that's responsive or sensitive, to me, when I hear the word responsive, I hear like a Band-Aid, right? Like we're trying to fix something that we know is broken. And at the beginning, we've said that like we know planning is fundamentally broken based off of who is assumed the subject of planning. And now we have all these approaches where we're trying to fix it. And as somebody who spent a lot of time in the field and has dedicated my career to it, I'm not saying particularly that we need to get rid of planning, because I don't have another option. There's a lot of people that have invested the same amount of time, if not obviously more, in that room. But like, if we know the system is broken, are we going to continue to just do responsive approaches? And at what point does that, I've been wrestling, I've been thinking about this for a while. So just leave it there.
I just wanted to add something, and I'm so glad you brought up both safety and questions of need. But you know, when you're thinking about equity, right? We still know that women get paid less than men for the same job, regardless of care. I mean, it came up, right? It came up. I think one of you said there's so few women in leadership. Somebody else said, and we know, except government jobs, they get paid the same, but in the private sector, they get paid less. Sometimes over a career, they'll get paid less because there's all kinds of other things coming in. And maybe there's data that shows that even in government jobs, they get paid less. I don't know. So it's not just about care. And then what happens to women who are not caregivers? Why are women defined as caregivers? I mean, there are lots of women who don't do care work in the same kinds of ways. And so the care part may be one way to think about it, and safety, of course, is one way to think about it, and needs is another way to think about it. But equity is a really important piece as well, and justice. And when it comes to questions of salaried work, what does that mean? Just like political presence, what does that mean? And so for the students in 5130, I'd encourage you to think capaciously. That seems to be the word of the day, right? In terms of really thinking about what women, gender, all of those pieces, how does that work? It's not just about care, it's much more than that.
Thanks, Nima. So proceeding with my greedy second question, I'd like to ask Chun and Yu, in the course of doing this research, I know that you are both not from America. Thank you for doing this hard work on behalf of this country, but I'm curious how doing this work has made you or has influenced your understanding and your thinking about planning in Chinese cities.
Thank you for the question. I think that is a really good question. Let me think about it. So as a Chinese student, when I come to United States, I at the very beginning stage, I felt like it will be much better here when you can speak out your opinion and try to figure out it's more equal for the women. And when I do the research about the comprehensiveness, I figure out that there are some similar situations there. Even in China, the Chinese language is also fairly neutral. So what we find nothing here, it means that in the development stage, just like Nima said, 20 years ago, it is a cool thing to talk about gender, and 20 years later, it still become a Christian. It's a cycle. So I think when I grew up, I didn't feel a lot about inequality there because I'm the generation that I grew up become single child in my family. But when I grew up, I feel like the society still have a lot of things, especially when you become a professional woman and you want to do something in a career. You feel like that the market of the professional area, there are a lot of equity exists. It's a similar thing in United States and in China. I think this kind of research, we are trying to look as much comprehensive plans as possible and found that it's very similar situation. It happens all around the world. Even in Europe, I know Europe doing a lot of gender mainstreaming thing, which is very modern and very progressive, but still the situation is we need to call out women and try to get women getting more involved in the process or get them more involved on the table. That is my thought. Do you want to add something?
Thank you, Chun, and thank you, Linda, for asking this hard question. So my thinking is, after doing this research and after so many conversations with Melissa and Andy and also other people, I really realized that this question, to gender or not to gender, is really much more complex than I thought. And it seems to me that whether or not calling out gender in the planning paradigm and think about the women's needs, in planning, all seems to me like fixing a system that should be changed. Without changing this system, everything we are doing is just amend the system, and also the oppression really comes from all directions and can be in very subtle way. There are some operations we can notice, but there are more operations coming from very they're beyond our notice. So this is my thoughts. But from today's conversation, I really appreciate that Professor Warner gives us more encouragement and more confidence that this system and that planning is a system that can be changed, that is oriented to change. That's really encouraging. Thank you.
From the speakers? Andy, Melissa? Yes. Oh, one last question.
Hello, thank you for your great presentation. Actually, last semester I also take the class, urban theory class. Thank you, Nima and Linda. And we are talking about the gender issues is closely intertwined with race, informality, poverty, and equity issues. So it's really, really important. So I'm thinking, would it be better for our planners, for planners to try to appreciate the significance of gender perspectives by combining the gender issues with informality issues, with poverty issues, with race issues, and by showing that all these aspects are indispensable. By doing so, can we emphasize that how important gender issues are, and will that make some change as we discussed just now? Yeah, thank you.
So that's back to the intersectionality question. Is there any final comments from the panelists on Jumbo's question?
I have a thought. I think. Oh gosh, no, I just lost it. Sorry. Yes, let me come back to it. I'm going to mute myself, but I do have a thought.
I'm glad it's not just me today. I had the same issue earlier. I mean, I think, yes, intersectionality is important for many reasons, as was just stated, and you're right, women make less money, they're more likely to be in poverty, they're more likely to be the sole caregiver, they're less likely to own property, and you know, and the same for women of color. I don't know how, you know, I think raising that is important, but I think it's important also not to generalize or not to more strongly reinforce some of those associations. So I would like to think about that one. I think there's a lot of it's an important thing to consider, and there are a lot of different aspects to consider. And again, considering some of the unintended implications would be important.
I did remember. So thank you. That actually helped. So I think the answer for, I would say, is yes. I think that the way planners communicate and they write and the words they choose and where they put those words matter. And planners have a lot more power when it comes to that than I think they actually think. So for example, I think if I was writing like a comprehensive plan, you could say something along the lines of, but users experience space differently, where you could say, but the use of transportation is dependent upon a person's blank, 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 and blank. And so you might not have to identify one group, but I think instead of, and I know we've started to do that, but just putting that one sentence in, and maybe it's not like, you know, compared to, you know, white men, women do, you know, it's not that, but even just putting like a sentence in every now and then just says that reminds people, reminds your electeds, that reminds the community that we acknowledge to the community that we've heard that you experience space differently, probably than a planner, than an elected. You can just put a sentence in there, and man, I'm working on a sub-area plan right now that I'm going to go put that sentence in. Like that would just be really helpful. And for my job now, as I staff electeds, I think that's something else that I can do, right? So I think it depends on your role sometimes. And that's one of the privileges I have in my role. So I can point out to my electeds that this policy is going to impact these groups. And on an interesting note, another thing that we're exploring, and to back about equity, so I review policy, but one of the things that we're looking at is doing an equity review on every piece of policy based off of an accepted set of like an equity report and determinants of equity that King County has adopted. And so next year in all of our staff reports, we will have a part that says, this will impact these groups based on these standards, and it will identify the groups that could potentially have a disproportionate impact. So I think the long answer is yes. I actually think that that is a good strategy, is to start to use a planner's ability to communicate and write and use that.
Thank you very much to our panelists, Andy Miklo, Melissa Perry. Thank you to our student leaders, Chun and Wang, and for your research. Thank you to the audience, the 50 people in this room and the 30 people in the virtual room for asking questions. And I hope those of you who are students will consider joining the Women's Planning Forum, and I hope the Women's Planning Forum will consider joining the Women in Planning Division of the APA. And thank you all very, very much for organizing a very fun discussion and very insightful.
Thank you so much. That was so great. I learned a lot. I really appreciate it. I would love to keep in touch and do this with the division too. I'm going to sign off, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us and bring your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Keep in touch.